Welcome back to Roleplay Riot. We are covering The Hobbit, Chapter 5, Part 11. Suddenly, without any warning, he trotted splash into the water. Ugh! It was icy cold. That pulled him up short and sharp. He did not know whether he was just a pool in the path, or the edge of an underground stream that crossed the passage, or the brink of a deep, dark subterranean lake. The sword was hardly shining at all. He stopped, and he could hear, when he listened hard, drops drip, drip, dripping from an unseen roof in the water below. But there seemed to be no other sound. So it is a pool or a lake, and not an underground river, he thought. Still, he did not dare to wade out into the darkness. He could not swim, and he thought too of nasty, slimy things with big, bulging, blind eyes, wriggling in the water. There are strange things living in pools and lakes in the hearts of mountains. Fish whose fathers swam in goodness knows how many years ago and never swam out again, while their eyes grew bigger and bigger and bigger from trying to see in the blackness. Also, there are other things more slimy than fish. Even in the tunnels and caves the goblins have made for themselves, there are other things living unbeknown to them that have sneaked in from outside to lie up in the dark. Some of the caves, too, go back to their beginnings, to ages before goblins, who only widened them and joined them up with passages, and the original owners are still in odd corners, slinking and nosing about. Deep down, here in the dark water, lived old Gollum, a small, slimy creature. I don't know where he came from, nor who or what he was. He was Gollum, as dark as darkness, except for two big, round, pale eyes in his thin face. He had a little boat, which he rowed around quietly on the lake, for lake it was, wide and deep and deadly cold. He paddled with his large feet dangling over the side, and never a ripple did he make, not he. He was looking out of his pale lamp-like eyes for blind fish, which he grabbed with his long fingers, quick as thinking. He liked meat, too. Goblin, he thought good, when he could get it. But he took care they never found him out. He just throttled them from behind if ever they came down alone near the edge of the water while he was prowling about. They very seldom did, for they had a feeling that something unpleasant was lurking down there, down in the very roots of the mountain. They had come down to the lake when they were tunneling long ago, and found they could go no further. So their road ended in that direction, and there was no reason to go that way, unless the great goblin sent them. Sometimes he took a fancy for fish from the lake, and sometimes neither goblin nor fish came back. Actually, Gollum lived on a slimy island of rock in the middle of the lake. He was watching Bilbo now from the distance of his pale eyes like telescope. Bilbo could not see him, but he was wondering a lot about Bilbo, for he could see that he was no goblin at all. Gollum got into his boat and shot off from the island, while Bilbo was sitting on the brink, altogether flummoxed and at the end of his way and his wits. Suddenly, up came Gollum, and whispered and hissed, "Bless us and splash us, my precious. I guess it's a choice feast. At least a tasty morsel it will make us, Gollum." And when he said Gollum, he made a horrible swallowing noise in his throat. That was how he got his name, although he always called himself my precious. The hobbit jumped nearly out of his skin when the hiss came in his ears, and suddenly he saw the pale eyes sticking out at him. "Who are you?" he said, thrusting his dagger out in front of him. "What is he?" My precious, whispered Gollum, who always spoke to himself, though never having anyone else to speak to. This is what he'd come to find out, for he was not really very hungry at the moment, only curious. Otherwise he would have grabbed first and whispered afterwards. I am Mr. Bilbo Baggins, and I have lost the dwarves, and I have lost the wizard, and I don't know where I am, and I don't want to know if only I can get away. What has he got in his hands, said Gollum, looking at the sword, which he did not quite like. A sword, a blade which came out of Gondolin. Said Gollum, and became quite polite. Perhaps you sit and chat with it, Bitsy, my precious. It likes riddles? Perhaps it does. Does it? He was so anxious to appear friendly, at any rate for the moment, until he found out more about the sword and the Hobbit, and whether he was alone really, and whether he was good to eat, and whether Gollum was really hungry. Riddles were all he could think of. Asking them and sometimes guessing them had been the only game he had ever played with other funny creatures sitting in their holes in the long, long ago, before he lost all his friends and was driven away alone and crept down, down into the dark under the mountains. Very well, said Bilbo, who was anxious to agree until he found out more about the creature, whether he was quite alone, or whether he was fierce or hungry, or whether he was a friend of the goblins. You ask first, he said, because he had not time to think of a riddle. So Gollum hissed, What has roots as nobody sees, is taller than trees. Up, up it goes, and yet never grows. Easy, said Bilbo. Mountains, I suppose. Does it guess easy? It must have a competition with us, Precious. If Precious asks and it doesn't answer, we eats it, my Precious. If it asks us and we doesn't answer, then we does what it wants, eh? We show it the way out, yes? All right, said Bilbo, not daring to disagree and nearly bursting his brain to think of riddles that could save him from being eaten. 30 white horses on a red hill. First they champ, then they stamp, then they stand still. That was all he could think of to ask. The idea of eating was rather on his mind. It was rather an old one, too, and Gollum knew the answer as well as you do. Chestnuts, chestnuts, he hissed. Teeth, teeth, my precious, but we have only 6. Then he asked his second. Voiceless it cries, wingless flutters, toothless bites, mouthless mutters. Half a moment, said Bilbo, who was thinking uncomfortably about eating. Fortunately, he had once heard something rather like this before. Getting his wits back, he thought to answer. Wind, wind, of course, he said, and he was so pleased he made one up on the spot. This will puzzle this nasty little underground creature, and he thought. An eye in a blue face saw an eye in a green face. This eye is like to that eye, said the first eye, but in low place, not in high place. Said Gollum. He had been underground for a long time, and he was forgetting this sort of thing. But just as Bilbo was beginning to hope that the wretch would not be able to answer, Gollum brought up memories of ages and ages before, when he had lived with his grandmother in a hole in a bank by the river. My precious, he said, sun on the daisies, it means it does. But these ordinary, above-ground, everyday sort of riddles were tiring for him. Also, they reminded him of days when he had been less lonely and sneaky and nasty, and that put him out of temper. What is more, they made him hungry. So this time he tried something a bit more difficult and more unpleasant. It cannot be seen, cannot be felt, cannot be heard, cannot be smelt. It lies beneath stars and under hills, and empty holes it fills. It comes first, follows after, ends life, kills laughter. Unfortunately for Gollum, Bilbo had heard that sort of thing before, and the answer was all around him anyway. Dark, he said, without scratching his head or putting on his thinking cap. A box without hinges, key, or lid, yet golden treasure inside is hid. He asked the king time, until he could think of a really hard one. This he thought dreadfully easy chestnut, though he had not asked it in the usual words. But it proved a nasty poser for Gollum. He hissed to himself, and still he did not answer. He whispered and he spluttered. After some time, Bilbo became impatient. Well, what is it? He said. The answer is not a kettle boiling over, as you seem to think from the noise you're making. Give us a chance! Let it give us a chance, my precious! Well, said Bilbo, after giving a long chance, what is your guess? But suddenly Gollum remembered thieving from nests long ago, and sitting under the river bank teaching his grandmother to suck. Eggs, he hissed. Eggs it is. Then he asked, alive without breath, as cold as death, never thirsty, ever drinking, all in mail, never clinking. He also, in turn, thought this was a dreadfully easy one, because he was always thinking of the answer, but he could not remember a better one at the moment. He was so flustered by the egg question. All the same, it was a real poser for poor Bilbo, who never had anything to do with the water if he could help it. I imagine you know the answer, of course, or can guess it as easy as winking, since you are sitting comfortably at home and have not the danger of being eaten to disturb your thinking. Bilbo sat and cleared his throat once or twice, but no answer came. After a while, Gollum began to hiss with pleasure to himself. Is it nice, my precious? Is it juicy? Is it scrumptiously crunchable? He began to peer at Bilbo out of the darkness. Half a moment, said Hobbit, shivering. I gave you a good long chance just now. It must make haste, said Gollum, beginning to climb out of his boat onto the shore to get at Bilbo. But when he put his long webby toe into the water, a fish jumped out in fright and fell on Bilbo's toes. Ugh! It's cold and clammy, and so he guessed. Fish! Fish! He cried. It is a fish! Gollum was dreadfully disappointed that Bilbo had said another riddle as quick as he could, so that Gollum had not the chance to go back into his boat and think. No legs lay on one leg. 2 legs sat on 3 legs. 4 legs got some. It was not really the right time for the riddle, but Bilbo was in a hurry. Gollum might have had some trouble guessing it if he had asked it another time. As it was, talking of fish, no legs was not so very difficult, and after that the rest was easy. Fish on a little table, man at the table sitting on a stool, the cat has the bones. And of course that was the answer, and Gollum soon gave it. Then he thought this time to ask something hard and horrible. This is what he said. This thing all thing devours, birds, beasts, trees and flowers, gnaws iron, bites steel, grinds hard stones to meal, slays kings, ruins towns, and beats high mountains down. Poor Bilbo sat in the dark thinking of all the horrible names of all the giants and ogres he had ever heard told of in tales, but not one of them had ever done all of these things. He had a feeling the answer was something quite different, and that he ought to know it, but he could not think of it. He flapped into the water. Gollum began to get out of his boat. He flapped into the water and paddled to the bank. Bilbo could see his eyes coming towards him. His tongue seemed to stick into his mouth. He wanted to shout out, "Give me more time! Give me more time!" But all that came out was a sudden squeal, "Time! Time!" Bilbo was saved by pure luck, for that, of course, was the answer. Gollum was disappointed once more, and now he was getting angry. He was also tired of the game. It had made him very hungry indeed. This time he did not go back into the boat. he sat down in the dark by Bilbo. This made the hobbit most dreadfully uncomfortable and scattered his wits. "It's got to ask us a question, my precious. Yes, yes, yes. Just one more question to guess. Yes, yes," said Gollum. But Bilbo simply could not think of any questions with the nasty, wet, cold thing sitting next to him, and pawing and poking him. He scratched himself. He pinched himself. He could not think of anything. Ask us," said Gollum. Bilbo pinched himself, slapped himself, he gripped on his little sword, he even felt in his pocket with his other hand. Then he found the ring he had picked up in the passage and forgotten about. "What have I got in my pocket?" he said aloud. He was talking to himself, but Gollum thought it was a riddle, and he was also frightfully upset. And if you want to hear what Gollum says in response, we'll cover that in the next part. Thank you so much for watching Role Play Riot.